So there has been this ongoing debate and discussion around Zach Lavine and his upcoming free agency and whether or not the Bulls should offer him a max contract. Now, I'm sure for some you'll say, what are you talking about? There was never a debate. The consensus is he should be getting a max contract when he becomes a free agent. And I agree, that was probably the case for most Bulls fans going into last offseason. But even still, you have some Bulls fans unsure whether or not now, I feel more often you're seeing the sentiment of Zach Lavine getting the max starting to shift a bit, where you have probably, say, 95 to 97% of Bulls fans saying, yes, absolutely, Zach is worth a max last year, to now being more in that 75% range. And I'm basing that range on the results of some polls that I put out on various platforms, which I'll show you guys in a little bit. But in today's video, we're going to be doing a deep dive on assessing whether Zach Lavine should in fact get the max, what are the Bulls' options for his contract, and what's the most likely scenario to happen among these options. So what's going on, everyone? You're listening to Bulls Central here. Hope you're all doing well. Now, I'm sure most people know this, but for those who don't, it's a good thing to lay out a bit of history around Zach Lavine and his current contract. For those that don't remember, Levine was included in that trade package that sent Jimmy Butler to the Minnesota Timberwolves in exchange for Chris Dunn, who is now out of the league and playing in the G League, I believe, Minnesota's number 7 pick, which the Bulls used to select Lauri Markkanen, who the Bulls moved in a sign and trade to Cleveland this past offseason, and of course Zach Lavine, who at the time was on the last year of his rookie deal and was coming off an ACL injury. And I believe the Bulls also traded their first round pick to the Wolves, which was the 16th pick, but the guy that they drafted didn't really amount to much in the league and is out of the league anyway. Now, that's how Zach Lavine came to Chicago. Again, I'm sure most of you already know that. Now, going into the offseason after Levine's first season in Chicago, in which he only played about a half a year or so, given he was still recovering from that ACL injury that he sustained while he was still on the Wolves, Levine was set to be a restricted free agent. And the old Bulls front office, in true Garpax fashion, didn't right away commit to Levine. They wanted to see what his value was according to the market and assess whether they would match an offer. And sure enough, Levine did receive a 4-year, $78 million contract from the Sacramento Kings, which the Bulls did, of course, match to retain him, and Levine has been on that contract ever since. He's currently in the final year of that deal at $19.5 million a year. Now, I think we can all agree whether Levine deserves a max or not going into next season, he has more than outplayed that contract. Like, the guy is now a 2-time All-Star, one of the top scorers in the game on great efficiency, and when you look at other guys around the league making around that same amount on an annual basis, or even more than Levine, you realize Levine is vastly underpaid. To put it into perspective, here are some guys who are making more than Zach Lavine is right now. Harrison Barnes, Jeremy Grant, Danilo Gallinari, Gary Harris, Tim Hardaway Jr., Buddy Hield, John Collins, Al Horford, Gordon Hayward. Like, I think we can all agree Levine is better than all these guys, despite getting paid less. Now, at the same time, that's also part of the business of the NBA. You get paid based on your value at the time for which you signed a contract. Whether you outplay or underperform relative to that contract over time, it doesn't really matter. That happens all the time in the NBA. And that also includes guys who received max level contracts who fell off after receiving a max deal. But that aside, no one can deny that Levine has outplayed his contract, period. What guys are making around his level, and the fact that he's a back-to-back All-Star proves that point. Now, going into this offseason, Levine will of course be an unrestricted free agent, meaning he is free to sign with any team that he wants, unlike being a restricted free agent in which he could receive offers from other teams, but his current team would have the ability to match any offer in order to retain him. That being said though, the Bulls will still have the upper hand in retaining Zach Lavine by being able to offer more than any other team around the league. That's the rule that the league put in place many years ago for teams to be able to retain their star level players that they either drafted or traded for by having the advantage to offer them more money. Really, it was designed for small market teams to be able to keep their best players rather than just always having them walk to bigger markets, even though that still does happen occasionally. But for the Bulls, they have the ability to offer Zach Lavine a max contract to the tune of 5 years worth a little over $205 million. And if Lavine makes an All-NBA team, he'll be eligible for a supermax extension, which would bump up that total to around $220 million, which is just insane when you're talking about figures that high. So for all those that are young watching this, keep working on your game. That's all I gotta say. But anyway, that's what the Bulls will be able to offer Zach Lavine, whereas any other team around the league, the max they will be able to offer him is a 4-year, $160 million deal. So for Levine, That's a lot of money to be leaving on the table to go to another team. You're talking in the range of $40 to $60 million, whether he gets a max or super max from the Bulls. That being said, though, on a per year basis, it's roughly the same, although the Bulls would still be able to pay higher, but the benefit is you get that extra year of guaranteed money, and in the age of this NBA, where you never know what might happen as it relates to injuries or a drop-off in play, having that security of a 5-year deal is very valuable to players. Now, all that being said, is Zach Lavine worth a max deal? And I say worth as opposed to deserved, because I know a lot of people will say, well, he might not necessarily be a max level player talent-wise, but he deserves to get that kind of contract because he outplayed his current deal and did so on a bad Bulls team for so many seasons, which, yes, I agree, he outplayed his contract and has been underpaid the last 2 or 3 years. But that's the nature of the NBA, as I mentioned earlier. That happens. It's why you signed the contract that you did, knowing that you could very well outperform that contract. So the question is more around, is Zach Lavine worth a max deal? Not even talking about a supermax contract, because we won't know if Levine will be eligible for that, although it's very possible. I think he could easily be selected as an All-NBA third-team member. But we're going to assume for the purposes of this video is that Zach Lavine, is he worth a max contract, meaning the 5-year, $205 million deal, which would be a little over $40 million a year. Now, I wanted to hear from you guys. What do you think about Levine getting a max contract? Do you think he is worth that much? And I asked this in both the community page as well as on Twitter. And I was a little surprised by the results, but among 3,300 votes or so, you can see that 72% of you felt that yes, he is worth a max contract, whereas 28% of you are saying no. And on Twitter, which by the way, if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can do so at BullCentralYT. A link to that can also be found in the description. But the results from Twitter, somewhat similar, but a smaller number of votes among over 400 votes. You had 78-22 breakdown between yeses and nos. No, I wish I had asked this question at the beginning of the season or in the offseason, because I'm almost certain the results would have been a 95-5 split, 95% being yeses. So I think that's what I was most surprised by. I didn't expect that drastic of a turn. I thought this would be more of a 80-20 type result. And I think some of that has to do with Zach's recent play. Granted, he himself admitted he's not 100% because of his knee. And I think it's also because DeMar DeRozan has kind of taken over as that #1 option for the Bulls and has really looked like the Bulls' best player on most nights. So people have started rethinking their view on whether or not Zach can be a true #1 option on a contending team or a guy that you build your franchise around. Either way, though, the majority of fans do still feel that, yes, he is worth a max contract. Now, what are the options for the Chicago Bulls as it relates to Zach Lavine's free agency? Or I guess I should say, what are the options for Zach Lavine, really? It would be 1, the 5-year, $205 million max contract, or a 5-year, $220 million contract should he qualify for the super max if he makes an All-NBA team. The other is leaving to go to another team for 4 years, $160 million, or the Bulls offer a lesser amount than the max contract based on his perceived value, which obviously they risk Zach saying, no thanks, I'm going to another team. Or the last option is the Bulls do a sign-in trade in which Zach demands a max contract or he's walking. They work out a sign-in trade to where Zach gets his max money, but they send him to another team and they get some value for him in return. And let's assume for a moment the Bulls sign Zach to a max offer sheet at 5 years, $205 million. To really assess whether he's worth a max contract like that, you have to compare it to the market value around the league and the history of the kind of players who have received max contracts in the past, as well as the Bulls situation too, right? Like, even if they don't feel that Levine is worth a max contract, or if the market deems he is not worth it, do they even have much of an option to potentially lose a player like Levine? So first, let's compare what Zach would be getting paid on an annual basis compared to others around the league for a max deal. If Zach Lavine was getting a little over $40 million a year starting next season, and again, some of this might change slightly because certain players' salaries are front-loaded, some are back-loaded, but Zach would be the 7th highest paid player in the NBA. The only players that would be making more than him would be LeBron James, Kevin Durant, Russell Westbrook, John Wall, James Harden, and Steph Curry. Now, aside from Westbrook and John Wall, because I think we can all agree they are overpaid relative to their agreement, but for the rest, is Zach Lavine in that tier of guys like LeBron, KD, James Harden, and Steph Curry? Not only that, he would be getting paid more than guys like Giannis, Damian Lillard, Kawhi Leonard, Paul George, Joel Embiid, and Nikola Jokic. Like, that's some pretty top-level talent when you look at the overall pool across the NBA. Now, all that being said, though, there have been a lot of players in the past in the NBA who received max contracts that probably weren't worth max deals even at the time that they did sign their deal. I'm talking about guys like Andrew Wiggins, Pascal Siakam, Ben Simmons, Kristaps Porzingis. A lot of people question Devin Booker when he was offered a max contract, but has since proved that he is worth that. Gordon Hayward, once he received a max contract back in the day. De'Aaron Fox, I believe, also signed a max deal after his rookie scale deal expired. Brandon Ingram also signed a max deal after his rookie contract. So, like, there are definitely players who, even when they signed their max offer sheet, probably weren't worth that amount. But the team signing them didn't really have a lot of options and would have been in a bad situation had they not re-signed these players. So for the Bulls, outside of signing Levine to the max, because again, Zach is going to want the max. He has said that multiple times throughout the season and offseason. He wants what he deserves and he'll get what he's earned, meaning a max contract, which is still a little strange that Zach keeps saying that. But anyway, outside of signing Zach to the max to really keep this team intact, what are your other options? Well, it's really not that much. Zach is really the top unrestricted free agent going into this offseason. James Harden, Bradley Beal, Kyrie Irving, they all have player options for the last years of their deal, and they're going to take their player options. There's no other way of going around that. I could potentially see that Bradley Beal maybe doesn't take his player option, but outside of that, you have guys like Gary Harris, Ricky Rubio, Andre Iguodala, Yusuf Nurkic. Like, those are the other options in terms of other free agents outside of Zach Lavine that you could see as an alternative. Yes, they could execute a sign and trade, but again, sign and trades are tricky because you have to have all parties agree to said sign and trade. And for most teams, why give up pieces to get a player in a sign and trade when they can just sign that player outright without having to give up anything? So I don't see a sign and trade all that likely, although I wouldn't say it's out of the question when it comes to this Bulls front office, since they signed and executed 3 sign and trades alone this past offseason for DeMar DeRozan, Lonzo Ball, and Lauri Markkanen. But then, if you do a sign and trade, you have to ensure you get a piece that at least equals Zach's value and impact in return. Are you going to be able to find a player that in the league and a team that is willing to give up a player of that caliber? Someone had a hot take in yesterday's video that Donovan Mitchell would be a good option for a trade. That's really the only one I see likely that would be a similar caliber level player that their current team could look to trade if they perceive Donovan Mitchell wants out of Utah. But again, I don't think they're going to give up on Mitchell that easily. The other option for a signing trade is maybe you get a couple lesser pieces in return for Zach Lavine. Lesser players right now, but have a lot of potential for the future. So young players who have a lot of promise and prying them away from a team that is potentially contending now and looking for a win now piece that Zach Lavine would be able to fit into. But then for the Bulls, where does that leave you when you have DeMar DeRozan and Nikola Vucevic who are in their 30s? And your win now window is closing if you move away from Zach Lavine, who is in the peak of his prime. So look, I've rambled on quite a bit about this, but in short, whether the Bulls front office or even Bulls fans for that matter think Zach is worth a max or not, it kind of doesn't really matter. Because based on what other players in the past have received in getting max contracts who weren't even as good as Zach is as a player, and it was primarily done because a team couldn't afford to let said player walk, the Bulls are going to have to pay Zach a max contract. Do I think Zach is worth a max contract? If I had to say purely based on the idea that you're committing long-term to Zach being the future face of this franchise, that you're going to build around for the next 5 years, committing that kind of salary cap space until he's 32 years old, because Vucevic and DeRozan are not going to be on this team long-term, I would say he's probably not worth it, especially when you compare it to the tier of players who would be making around that same level of money as Levine would be at $40 million a year. But if we're solely looking at as if Zach is worth a max based on what the going market rate is for a player of his caliber in the league and what has historically been handed out to players, yeah, he probably is. In an ideal world, I would love for Zach Lavine to remain on the Bulls, but on a slightly lesser contract to the tune of, say, $30 to $33 million a year, because it gives the Bulls more cap flexibility. It buys them a little bit of insurance, if you will, if Zach starts to regress, which I don't think he will, but it's something to think about. And it still gives Zach a very nice payday, and it puts the Bulls in a position to be successful for the long term. So I know this was a long video. Shout out to all of those who are still watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it. And I also want to hear from you guys. What do you think about Zach Lavine's contract situation? What do you think the Bulls should do? Let me know in the comments. And as always, be sure to subscribe if you're a Bulls fan, as I do post daily Bulls content. Thanks again for tuning in, guys, and I will catch you in the next one.